In the last week, the president has made a couple of major speeches and devoted his entire weekend media address to the Buffett rule. When the president introduced the Buffett rule last September, he said it was a matter of fairness and this is the quote, "we also stabilize our debt and deficits for the next decade." But here's the math. The Buffett rule that millionaires should pay a minimum tax of 30% would bring in $47 billion over the next decade, while the president's budget adds $6.4 trillion to the deficit for the next decade. David, according to one estimate, the money you would get from the Buffett rule would cover just 17 days of the increased deficit under the Obama budget.
First of all, Chris, the president's proposal in total would cut the deficits by $4 trillion over the next decade and put us on a path to where the debt is stabilized and we're able to manage it, where it's just 3% of the total economy, which is where everyone agrees we need to be. In terms of the Buffett rule, I remember when $47 billion seemed like a lot of money. It is a lot of money. There is a question. When you reduce when you eliminate the Bush tax cuts for the very wealthy, that adds another $800 billion. So this is a piece of a larger pile, along with $1.5 trillion.
But would you agree? Would you agree that when
cuts? No, look, let me tell you something. Mitt Romney is out there arguing that we should cut Planned Parenthood because we can't afford it, funding for women's health programs because we can't afford it. That's $300 million a year. He says we have to cut foreign aid by $100 million a year. And that's because of the deficits. So you can't argue it both ways. This is a significantly larger piece of the budget.
If I may, David, I am going to get into a lot of that with Ed Gillespie in the next segment. But you would certainly agree that when the president introduced it last September and he said the Buffett rule would, quote, stabilize our debt and deficit over the next decade, that wasn't true.
No, what he said was it is part of an overall plan that will stabilize our debt and deficit, which his plan would. But nobody can argue. Nobody can argue, Chris. Nobody can argue that it makes sense for people who are making $1 million a year or more to pay less than the average middle-class worker in this country. So it both helps us stabilize the deficit and ensures a modicum of fairness in our tax system.
Well,
and if Mr. Gillespie and you want to argue otherwise, then that so be it. But for those $47 billion can be put to much greater use.
I'm going to have plenty of questions for Ed Gillespie. I want to ask you some questions. You just talked about the president and that it's not fair for rich people to pay a lower tax rate than middle-class people. The president introduced or released his tax returns this week. It turns out that he paid a tax rate of 20.5%, which is a lot less than the 30% he talks about. And yes, it is lower than what his secretary pays. And the question if I may, David, the question I have for you is, if the president feels so strongly about tax fairness, is he going to contribute money to the Treasury, and they have a special department just for this, to help with the deficit?
Listen, Chris, first of all, the reason that his tax rate was so low was in part because 22% of his income was donated to charity, mostly to these Fisher houses around veterans hospitals. So
Mitt Romney contributes a lot to charity as well. That's not the issue.
That's fine. Not quite. Yes, but there's no proportionality there. But here's the larger issue. The president's proposal would have him pay a higher rate of taxes in the future. Governor Romney's proposal would have him pay a lower tax rate in the future. So that's fundamentally different. We're arguing for a system that is fair. He's arguing for a system that would exacerbate the great gaps that we have in our system today. So
I take it then he's not going to contribute money to the Treasury to help with the deficit.
Listen, that's not the way we operate our tax system, okay? We don't run bake sales. It's not about volunteerism. We all kick in according to the system, and the system allows that. Look, the fact that Mitt Romney pays 14% on $20 million income is not the issue. The issue is that the system permits it, and he would perpetuate that, and he would enhance it.
Let me turn to the economy. 3 presidents have sought a second term since 1976. Let's look at their economic record. Jerry Ford had unemployment of 7.8% and GDP growth of 5.4%. For Jimmy Carter, unemployment was 7.5% and growth minus 0.3%. For Bush 41, 7.4% unemployment, 3.4% growth. The latest numbers for Barack Obama, 8.2% unemployment and 1.7% growth. In other words, this president has the worst unemployment rate and the second worst growth rate of those four presidents. Given that record, why does he deserve re-election?
Well, first of all, I think you asked me that same question about 7 or 8 months ago, and the numbers were much higher than that. And obviously, those numbers are coming down. We have created, there's no doubt that we walked into the greatest economic crisis since the Great Depression. Everybody agrees on that. In the 6 months before we took office, the country lost 4 million jobs. In the several months after that, the country lost 4 million jobs. In the last 25 months, we have seen 4.1 million private sector jobs created. If you look at the Bush recession, which was much gentler in 2001, that began in 2001, and the recovery from that recession, we've created 7 times as many jobs in 33 months, in the last 33 months, than he did in after his recession. So I think people look at where we were and where we are. But the bigger issue, Chris, isn't where we've been, it's where we're going. And are we going to create an economy in which the middle class can grow and not shrink, in which wages are growing, in which hard work is rewarded, responsibility is rewarded, and everybody from Main Street to Wall Street plays by the same rules? Are we going to make the kind of investment we need to get that sort of economy, education, research and development? Or are we going to shred that and just have an economy where people at the top do very well and everybody
David,
else
I'm going to give
is
you an
pedaling harder and harder?
I'm going to give you an opportunity for a
ahead.
closing statement in a moment. Let me just ask a couple of more questions.
Well, I was just trying to answer your question there.
Well, I think you went off onto your talking points, but in any case, Fox News came out with a new poll this week, and I want to put it up on the screen. It shows Romney with a slight edge over the president, although they're basically tied. And the president's approval rating is back down to 42%, with 51% disapproving. Even with all the battering that Romney has taken during this long primary season, he's basically running neck and neck with the president. And your guy is at this point well below the 50% approval rating, which is generally considered crucial for a president seeking re-election. My question is, isn't Barack Obama very vulnerable?
Well, I don't think we should spend a whole lot of time on your poll, Chris, because in February you had the poll, the partisan spread was 8 points different than it is now. And unless you believe that there are 7 million less Democrats in America today and 6 million more Republicans than there were in February, I wouldn't put much credence in this. There were 4 other public polls that had a much different result in the same time period. That's, and by the way, in your poll, the only you have us plummeting, but doing better among independents than we did in February. There isn't a person in America who knows something about this who would say that could possibly be true. That said, we've always said this was going to be a close race. It's a closely divided country. We won 53% of the vote in 2008 with the wind at our back. Of course it's going to be close. But at the end of the day, I think the American people want to choose a vision that holds out the greatest possible opportunity for them and for the middle class. They want to see our economy rebuilt in a way that will give them their best chance. Not go back to the policies that got us into this mess in the first place. Tax cuts for the wealthy.
And that is, David, if I may, the question that I wanted to ask you, in the final question I have, in one paragraph, 2 or 3 sentences, what's the choice in this election?
The choice in this election is between an economy that produces a growing middle class and that gives people a chance to get ahead and their kids a chance to get ahead, and an economy that continues down the road we're on, where a fewer and fewer number of people do very well and everybody else is running faster and faster just to keep pace. We need to take that first route that honors our fundamental economic values, the values that made this country great, and we need to do some things to promote that kind of economy. We can't sit back and go back to the same failed policies that were so disastrous in the last decade.
All right.